Chapter 15 Incredible Feat 8:15 p.m. Continued. Rebecca. When Ernie swapped identities to help us, he was also putting himself in danger. For all intents and purposes, he had suddenly become a Jew. Everybody knew what the Nazis thought of us, but we were not held in high regard by many others either. Even in America, we were considered the bottom of the food chain, and that's saying something with the amount of prejudice and racism in the States at that time. Doors opened for you if you were Italian or Irish. Their communities were well established. The Jews were scattered across the whole city, and the whole country for that matter, and we had to endure a lot of prejudice and hatred. Ernie needed to earn money to support the three of us, and at first, work was hard to come by. I remember early on, he was trawling the streets looking for some kind of regular employment, and that's when he met Robbie McNulty. Robbie was your typical Irishman, quick-witted, bubbly and colourful. He was labouring for a construction company on the west side, and when Ernie, or Daniel as he was then, asked him about job opportunities, Robbie persuaded his supervisor to give him a chance. Annabelle. At that point, paperwork was not considered essential. You didn't need a CV to push a wheelbarrow. Ernie said he was just known as the Jew on the site, but there was no malice in the nickname. Everyone had to have one on the site. I'm sure you can imagine what a building site is like. I think after a couple of weeks and over a few drinks, Ernie told Robbie how he had come to find himself in New York, and explained that he wasn't really the Jew, but the Englishman. Robbie joked that being English would put Ernie even lower down the social ladder in his eyes, and he would be better off sticking with his original nickname. After a while, Robbie advised him to drop the pretense and return to being Ernie. Nobody knew him. This was America. He could be whatever he wanted to be. And what better person to be than yourself? Rebecca. And it was as simple as that. Ernie was back, and Daniel was somewhere in England pretending to be Ernie. In time, we became official, I suppose. I can't remember how it happened. We registered with doctors and dentists. We secured proper jobs later on, and even started to pay taxes and insurance. Not Ernie, though. We had numbers attached to our identities. We could get passports and driver's licenses, and all of the other things you can have when you've got an identity. Annabelle. Ernie worked around the local construction industry for a couple of years. Robbie knew the scene really well. He was streetwise, and he had lots of contacts. Ernie and Robbie became good friends. At first, Robbie took Ernie under his wing, got him jobs, introduced him to people in the know. But Ernie was such an amiable, likeable character. People warmed to him immediately, and within a month or two he had more job offers than he could cope with. He was earning a good wage, and we wanted for nothing. When we moved in with our parents, Ernie kept the apartment on for himself. My father tried to convince him to stay with us, but he stayed in the apartment in the middle of Manhattan. He had fulfilled his promise to us. He had reunited us, and he wanted us to be a family again. It didn't seem to be a huge issue at the time. I don't think any of us were thinking too far into the future. We were just so happy with the present. It wasn't as easy to stay in touch in those days. Like we said, we didn't have phones or transport. New York was a vast city, even then, and we were still very new to the place. People say they will keep in touch, and they mean it when they say it, but life gets in the way, doesn't it? I asked, "You said Ernie became an entrepreneur. What do you mean? In what way?" Annabelle. Like I said, we kept in touch for a while, and he visited Washington Heights when he was able. It was always great to see him. Maybe entrepreneur wasn't the right word to use, but he was certainly doing well for himself, I think. We had received a letter from him, and it prompted my father to plan a visit to see him. My mother was unable to go for whatever reason, but the three of us took a bus into the city and to Midtown. He lived on East 23rd Street. You wouldn't recognize the place now. It's all offices, hotels, and trendy cafe bars. Back then it was a little rough and ready, but we liked it. We had good neighbours, and we were right in the middle of the island. It was only a 10-minute walk from the Empire State Building. We hadn't arranged with him to meet. Father wanted it to be a surprise for Ernie. We only had the address to go on, but we took a chance, and we were prepared to wait if he wasn't in. When we arrived, it brought back a lot of happy memories for us. Rebecca. Indeed it did. This had been our first proper home in America, our first home since we lost our family home to the Nazis. Remember, Ernie was like an older brother to us. He was only a young man, and he must have been scared and daunted by it all too. But we were only young teens, and to us he was the adult. We relied on him totally, and he didn't let us down, ever. He wasn't in the apartment when we arrived, and Father popped a note through the door to say we had come to see him, and that we would hang around for the day. We took the chance to explore and be tourists for the afternoon. The city was changing. New buildings were springing up all over the place. It was buzzing. We popped back to the apartment to see if he was in a couple of hours later. He wasn't, but there was a note on the door, and it was from Ernie. He must have returned home at some point and got Father's message. It just said that he was working in Madison Square Park, near the Flatiron Building, and we could join him there. We walked the handful of blocks back up to the park. I remember the streets were very busy, and when we arrived, the three of us were all looking round for construction sites. We just presumed that what he was doing that's what he would be doing for work. We were quite taken aback when we actually found him. He was sitting on one of two raised, comfy red chairs by the side of the path, drinking a can of something. Us young, inexperienced girls had no idea what he was doing there, but my father did. I remember him laughing out loud, and Ernie laughed too when they saw us approaching. "Ernie Grimshaw, shoe shine boy," my father shouted. It was so lovely to see him again. He told us both that he and Robbie had decided to try their luck in business and set up their own shoe polishing enterprise. Robbie was away at the shop somewhere restocking, and Ernie was putting his feet up for 5 minutes. Annabelle. Both of us jumped up and gave him a huge bear hug. It was great to see him again. It was great to see him looking so well and so happy. I remember sitting on the wall beside him as Father jumped up into the unused seat. He was wearing sandals, and we all laughed again when he cursed his luck for losing out on a freebie. Jews had a reputation for being mean, and my father only added fuel to that stereotype. Friends used to joke that Father would go on holiday to the same place twice, the first time for the break, and the second time to make sure he hadn't dropped anything. There was a sign beside Ernie's chair which said, "Closed until 3 p.m. He was on his break. My father asked him about the business. Was it making him enough money to live on? Did he enjoy it? He told us it had taken a while to build custom, but the two of them had soon started to build up a regular client base, mainly from the local office workers. They had only been at it 2 or 3 months, but were earning enough money to pay them a decent enough salary. My father was sceptical. Shoeshine boys are down there with the newspaper sellers in the land of low earners, but Ernie was never fazed by others' perceptions of him. He was convinced that they had found a gap in the market in the right place at the right time. To be honest with you, I think the two of them could have sold ice to Eskimos. They had the banter and the charm to win over just about anybody. They could read a person like a book. They seemed to know instinctively how to talk to someone or when to stay quiet and listen. They knew how to make someone laugh, but also when to offer kind words or sympathy. Even more importantly, they were genuine with it. It was never an act. They genuinely cared about and were interested in other people. Both of them cared about people. They were in the right business. On a few occasions we met Robbie when he accompanied Ernie up to Washington Heights. I think it's fair to say both of us girls had a bit of a crush on him. He was a handsome man, confident but not arrogant. I think he enjoyed the flirting. but he knew the limits. Had father known, I don't think he would have been too pleased with us. Rebecca. I could imagine customers sitting down for a shine and leaving with nicely polished shoes and feeling 10 feet tall. Ernie and Robbie just had that way about them. In one of the last letters I read from Ernie, he attached a newspaper clipping from the New York Times with the headline, "Incredible Feat." The article was written by a popular columnist at the time, Norman Templeton. It told the tale of two boys living the American dream. Goodness knows where it is now, probably in a box in the attic. The two boys in question, Ernie Grimshaw and Robert McNulty, had set up a shoeshine business in Madison Square Park and were pulling up trees. Punters were queuing around the block to take their turn in the chair. It used words like evangelical and devoted to describe their customers. Mr. Templeton had even interviewed some of them waiting in line, quoting them in the article. It was hysterical. Annabel. It was hilarious. I could just picture the scene. People were quoted as saying things like, "I wouldn't go anywhere else," and "It was well worth the wait." The boys could not have asked for a better advert. And underneath the headline was a picture of the two of them, sat in those big comfy chairs, grinning and holding up a brush in each hand. They looked so happy. It was a brilliant picture, and one that captured their personalities wonderfully well. It was not long after that we lost touch. From what you said earlier, he must have returned to England at some point. I'm so glad to hear he was alive. Just a couple of years ago as well. He deserved a long life. He made ours worth living again. I don't know where you go from here, Paul. We have at least continued the journey until 1952 or 53 before we lost track of him. Do you know what you're going to do next? It was a question I'd been asking myself as they were talking. My knowledge of the city wasn't great, and I didn't have much to go on, really. I figured I had two options: a trip to Madison Square Park, and secondly, a near impossible task of persuading someone at the New York Times to delve back in their archives to find a minor article from the 50s about a man who made a living polishing shoes in a park. And just to make things even harder, I only had 2 days in which to do it before I flew back to England. I would start early again tomorrow and go straight to the New York Times headquarters. I will need every ounce of charm to get past the doorman there, I reckon. When I left Washington Heights, I was kindly driven back to my hotel by the two rabbis. I still felt very positive and enthusiastic, despite the odds stacked against me. If this case has taught me anything, it is that you should always expect the unexpected and never give up hope. The two old ladies were living proof of that. I checked out the reporter on Norman Templeton on Google. He had been a journalist with the paper between 1949 and 1968 before moving on to work in TV behind the cameras. He was a stalwart of the profession in that era and highly respected. He penned a number of very famous and controversial articles around that time and had even been given the nickname by his peers. He was affectionately known as the Ferret, famous for not letting go once he had gotten his teeth into something. Before he passed away in 1991, he was one of America's best-known journalists, loved and loathed in equal measure. Hardly the kind of journalist to be writing jolly feel-good stories about two young scamps who had fallen on a bit of good fortune with their new shoeshine enterprise. Maybe he was taking a break from exposing murderers, armed robbers, celebrity affairs, and bent bankers. It could be a make-or-break day tomorrow, Mr. Diary. Let's have an early night and be ready for whatever the world throws at us tomorrow.